The word came out of her mouth so quietly that Hugh Monroe almost did not hear it over the howling of the wind pressing against the cabin walls like something alive and desperate to get in. Almost. But he heard it. He heard every syllable of it, and it cracked something open in his chest that he had spent 3 years sealing shut with work and whiskey, and the particular kind of loneliness that a man chooses for himself because it hurts less than being left again. "Could I stay?" Violet Cooper said. "Just through the cold, just until the pass is clear." She was standing in the middle of his floor with her dark hair plastered against her face from the snow, her coat so thin it was practically a suggestion of warmth rather than the thing itself. Her boots split at the left sole so that a crescent of her stocking showed through, and was soaked gray from the drifts she had walked through to reach his door. She was shaking. Not the polite kind of shaking that a person does to let someone know they are mildly uncomfortable. The deep, bone-rattling kind that takes hold of a person from the inside and will not be reasoned with. And Hugh Monroe, who had not spoken more than 20 words to another living soul in the past 6 days, who had told himself he did not want company and had believed it, who had a dark past that he had dragged out here to the high country of Wyoming territory specifically so it would not touch anyone else, looked at this woman in his doorway and felt every carefully constructed wall inside him begin to tremble. He could have said no. He should have said no. He said something else entirely. "You can stay through everything." He did not plan those words. They arrived fully formed from somewhere beneath his ribs, delivered in the low, certain voice of a man who has made a decision so complete that he did not even need to think about it. And the moment they left his mouth, the moment he watched Violet Cooper's shaking hand still for just one breath, he understood that the cold was not the real danger in this cabin tonight. The real danger was the way she looked at him when he said it. Like she had not heard a human being speak to her with that kind of intention in a very long time. Like she had forgotten, somewhere along the miles she had walked to get here, that people could mean what they said. That was the beginning. But to understand why those 4 words hit them both like a rifle shot, you have to go back. You have to go back to the morning 3 weeks earlier when Violet Cooper stepped off a stagecoach in the town of Garnet Creek, Wyoming territory, on the 11th of November, 1882, with a carpetbag in one hand, a folded letter in the other, and a secret that she was not yet ready to tell anyone. Garnet Creek was the kind of town that the railroad had not quite decided to visit yet. It sat in a bowl-shaped valley ringed by the first true peaks of the Rockies, close enough to the mountains that the shadows arrived early and stayed late. There were 2 streets that could honestly be called streets, a general store, a saloon called the Broken Spoke that had ambitions above its station, a livery, a doctor's office that doubled as the dentist and occasionally the barber, a land office, and a church whose bell had cracked in the freeze of 1879 and still rang with that fractured, flat sound every Sunday as if it had made peace with its own damage. Violet stepped down from the coach and stood in the cold air and looked at all of it. She was 24 years old and she had come from Denver, before that from Kansas City, before that from a small town in Indiana that she did not think about unless she was very tired or very frightened, in which case she thought about it constantly. She was not a mail-order bride. She wanted to be clear about that, at least in her own mind, because there was a difference between a woman who answered an advertisement for a husband and a woman who had answered an advertisement for a position as a school teacher, and had arrived to discover, via a note pinned to the door of the promised schoolhouse, that the position had been filled 2 weeks prior by the new mayor's daughter, who had no teaching experience but a great deal of political usefulness. So Violet Cooper stood in Garnet Creek, Wyoming territory, with $4.30 in her coat pocket, a teaching certificate that was suddenly decorative, and that letter, which was from her sister back in Indiana and which she had read so many times that the folds were beginning to separate into individual squares. The letter said, "Come home, Violet. Enough of this. Come home and marry Theodore Walsh and stop this running." Theodore Walsh was 47 years old and smelled of pipe tobacco, and the particular entitlement of a man who had never been told no by anyone with less money than himself. He had been pursuing Violet with the focused, humorless determination of a man who viewed a woman's reluctance as a navigational challenge rather than a genuine answer. He had spoken to her father before her father died. He had spoken to her brother-in-law after. Everyone in her world seemed to agree that Theodore Walsh was the solution to Violet Cooper, as if she were a problem that needed solving rather than a person who needed living. She had run from Indiana to Kansas City, from Kansas City to Denver, from Denver to Garnet Creek, following the advertisement for the teaching position that now no longer existed. She spent her first night in Garnet Creek at the boarding house run by a wide, practical woman named Mrs. Hadley, who served venison stew and hard biscuits and asked no questions, which Violet appreciated deeply. She spent the next morning at the land office, inquiring about work of any kind. She spent the afternoon at the general store, where a man named Arlo Prout, who had a broad red face and the demeanor of someone who had been suspicious of strangers since birth, ran the counter and told her there was no work for a woman of her particular skills in town, but that there was a ranch out on the eastern edge of the valley that had posted notice for a cook and housekeeper. Whose ranch? Violet asked. Hugh Monroe's place, Arlo Prout said, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, more like the careful neutrality of a man deciding how much to say. He's been out there alone since his wife passed. 3 years now, give or take. Good enough man, keeps to himself. What happened to his wife? Violet asked because she was thorough by nature, and because a woman in her position could not afford to walk into situations she did not understand. Arlo Prout looked at her for a moment. Fever, he said. Quick, it took her in 4 days. He was out on the north pasture when it started, and by the time he got back to her, it was the 2nd day and she was already burning up bad. Folks say he never forgave himself for not being there from the first hour. Violet absorbed this. Does he know you're telling people his private business? Arlo Prout's mouth twitched. I expect he does not. She rode out to the Monroe Ranch the following morning on a horse borrowed from Mrs. Hadley, who had asked no questions about that either but had told Violet to be back before dark because the weather had a look to it she did not trust. The ranch was 4 miles east of town, set against a low ridge that broke the wind from the north. It was not a grand spread by any standard. The house was solidly built, 2 stories of squared logs with a good roof and a covered porch, and the barn and outbuildings were in good repair, which told her more about the man than any amount of gossip could. A man who let his buildings rot was a man who had stopped caring about the future. A man who kept them up even when he was alone was a man still in conversation with tomorrow. She knocked on the door. There was a long silence, and then the sound of boots on a wooden floor, unhurried and deliberate, and then the door opened and she got her first look at Hugh Monroe. He was tall and solidly built, somewhere in his early 30s, with dark hair that had gone a little too long without cutting, and a jaw shadowed with several days of beard. He had gray eyes, the particular shade of gray that changes depending on the light, and those eyes settled on her with an attention that was not threatening, but was undeniably complete. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand rather than something he is trying to use, and that, Violet thought, was already a point in his favor. Hugh Monroe, she said. That's right. I heard you posted a notice for a cook and housekeeper. I'd like to discuss the position. He looked at her for another moment. Then he stepped back and held the door open and she walked into his house. The kitchen was clean but austere in the way that a space gets when no one uses it for joy, only for necessity. There was a good iron stove, a solid work table, shelves of provisions that were adequate but unimaginative. The main room had a stone fireplace and 2 good chairs and a table with papers on it that she recognized as land grant documents and cattle tallies. There were no decorations except for a small wooden cross above the fireplace and a single framed photograph on the mantel that she did not look at directly because it seemed like the kind of private grief that required permission to approach. He made coffee without being asked, and set a cup in front of her and sat across the table and they talked. He paid a fair wage, $5 a month plus room and board, which was honest. He wanted meals prepared twice daily, the house kept, and help with the washing. He had 12 ranch hands through the spring and summer but was down to 2 for the winter, brothers named Court and Dale Simmons who bunked in the bunkhouse and were, he said, easy enough to deal with if you did not try to be friendly with them before 8 in the morning. I have references, Violet said, and put her teaching certificate on the table. He looked at it. This is a teaching certificate. Yes. From the Indiana State Board of Education. Yes. You're a school teacher. I was going to be the school teacher here, Violet said, and explained about the advertisement and the note on the door, keeping her voice level and her expression composed because she had learned early in life that people took you seriously in proportion to how little you let your distress show. Hugh Monroe listened to all of it without interrupting, which was another point in his favor. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee. "I'll be honest with you," he said finally. "I don't need a school teacher. I need someone who can make the house feel less like a storage shed. I need someone who can cook something that isn't dried meat and canned beans. And I need someone who won't be unsettled by the quiet, because it gets quiet out here in a way that gets to some people." "I like quiet," Violet said, and meant it more than he could know. "Then we'll get along," he said. She started the following morning. For the first 2 weeks, they established the careful geography of 2 people sharing a space while maintaining their respective distances. She cooked breakfast and supper and kept the house, and he worked the ranch from before dawn until after dark, and came in for meals and spoke politely and thanked her and went back to work. They were scrupulously courteous with each other in the way that 2 people are when they are both trying very hard not to intrude on whatever private world the other person is carrying around inside themselves. But things have a way of thawing despite their best efforts. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just the gradual way that frost retreats from a window pane when the fire inside gets going enough. It started with the bread. On her 4th day there, Violet baked bread, real bread with a crust that had some life to it, and when Hugh Monroe came in from the cold and sat down at the table and took his first bite, something crossed his face that was so briefly unguarded that she looked away quickly because she felt she had seen something she was not supposed to see. He ate 3 slices before he remembered that he was the kind of man who did not express things. "That's good bread," he said. "Thank you," she said, very evenly. "My wife used to make bread like that," he said. And then, as if the sentence had surprised him by being spoken aloud, he set his fork down and looked at his plate and added nothing further. Violet said nothing. She understood that grief was a country with its own borders and customs, and a person could not just march across them without an invitation. But the door was cracked open now, just slightly, in the way that small truths crack things open. 2 days after that, she found him in the barn at dusk, not working but standing very still beside his horse with his hand on the animal's neck, and that look on his face that she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when the loneliness got too heavy to hold with both hands. She said nothing. She just brought him his supper in the barn instead of calling him in, set the plate on the workbench, and left. When she came back for the plate, it was empty, and there was a note on it in handwriting that was careful and slightly stiff, as if he had thought hard about each letter. "Thank you," it said. Just those 2 words, but they felt like more. The thing about Hugh Monroe that Violet had not been prepared for was not his grief, because she had known it was there. The thing she had not been prepared for was his intelligence. He read voraciously, which she discovered when she began dusting the shelves in the sitting room and found books everywhere, not just on shelves, but in stacks on the floor and on the windowsills, and tucked into the gap between the wall and the back of the wood box. He had Darwin and Emerson and a battered copy of Dickens's Bleak House that had been read so many times it no longer had a proper spine. He had geological survey reports for Wyoming territory that he had clearly studied with real attention, their pages annotated in the margins in that careful, stiff handwriting. She mentioned it at supper that evening. She said she had noticed his books. He looked at her across the table with those changing gray eyes. "Do you read?" he asked. "It's my primary vice," she said, something lit in his eyes that she had not seen there before. "What do you read?" "Everything," she said. "Novels mostly, but also natural history. I read Thoreau once through entirely and then started again from the beginning immediately after." "I have Thoreau," he said. "I know," she said. "I found it behind the kindling." He almost smiled. She saw the edges of it before he brought it back. "I hide the ones I'm embarrassed to have in plain sight," he said. "You're embarrassed by Thoreau." "By how many times I've read it," he said. And this time the smile completed itself, brief and genuine and transforming. And Violet Cooper looked at Hugh Monroe's smile for the first time and understood that she was in considerably more trouble than she had previously estimated. That night it snowed for the first time since she had arrived. Not the tentative, exploratory snow of early November, but a real declaration. 6 inches by morning with more coming. And the world outside the windows went entirely white and still, and the mountains disappeared behind low gray cloud. Court and Dale Simmons came by for their weekly provisions, and to report that the north fence line was holding, and that the cattle were moving to the lower pasture on their own, which was what cattle did when they knew what was coming. Court Simmons, the older of the two brothers, had the permanently narrowed eyes of a man who had spent a great deal of time outdoors squinting at things he did not trust, and he gave Violet a look when he came through the kitchen door that was not quite hostile but was assessing in a way she did not particularly enjoy. "You settling in all right?" he asked. It sounded like a question but had the quality of a test. "Very well, thank you," Violet said. "Monroe seems easier in himself," Court said, helping himself to coffee without being invited, which seemed to be his custom. "Since you arrived." "I'm glad," Violet said, and meant it. Court Simmons nodded and took his coffee and went back outside, and she was left alone with the quiet house and the snow, and the smell of the bread she was making, and the strange warm weight of having been told something important without quite knowing yet what to do with it. Hugh Monroe came in early that afternoon because the weather was making further outdoor work impossible, and for the first time they found themselves in the same room for an extended period without the structure of a meal to organize around. He sat by the fire with Bleak House. She sat at the table writing a letter to her sister, the content of which was deeply fictitious because the actual truth of her situation was too complicated to explain, and also because she did not want her sister knowing where she was, specifically because her sister would tell Theodore Walsh. After a while Hugh said, without looking up from his book, "What are you writing?" "A letter," Violet said. "To someone who worries about you." She paused. "How did you know?" "The way you're choosing your words," he said. "You keep stopping and looking out the window like you're trying to decide what not to say." She put down her pen. "My sister, she wants me to come home." "And you don't want to go?" "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Is it a good home?" Violet considered this honestly. "It was once. It's different now. My father died 2 years ago and my sister married a man who thinks very practically about things, including me. There is a situation there that I am not interested in returning to." Hugh looked up from his book then, those gray eyes direct and quiet. "A man." It was not quite a question. She answered it anyway. "A man who has been told he can have me and believes what he's been told." "You weren't consulted?" "Not in any way that was considered relevant." Hugh Monroe looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Well, you're here now," with a simplicity and a finality that made it sound less like an observation and more like a position he was staking out on her behalf. And Violet Cooper felt something shift inside her that she was not ready to name yet, but that she recognized as significant. The snow kept coming through November. The passes on both ends of the valley road were manageable in the first week but worsening steadily, and Garnet Creek settled into the particular winter rhythm of a mountain town, slower and quieter and more interior. Violet rode into town twice a week with the buckboard for supplies and mail, and she began to know the shape of the place better and the people in it. She liked the doctor, a young man of 28 named Ellis Carr who had come west from Philadelphia and was earnest and competent and good-humored in the way of someone who had chosen a genuinely difficult path and found it genuinely satisfying. She liked the pastor's wife, a woman named Ruth Hanby, who brought her dried apple cake the second week and asked nothing in return and seemed to enjoy Violet's company on its own terms. She was more cautious about Arlo Prout at the general store, not because he was unkind but because he talked, as general store owners always did, and she did not want her business becoming the town's entertainment. She was careful also about the letter she wrote in response to her sister. She said she was well. She said she had found a position and was comfortable. She did not say where she was. She mailed it from the post office without a return address, which she was aware was not entirely honest but which was, she felt, necessary. What she did not know, could not know, was that Theodore Walsh had already engaged a man to find her. The man's name was Desmond Fry. He operated out of Denver as what he described, with some dignity, as a private inquiry agent, though his methods had somewhat broader ethical parameters than that title suggested. He was thorough and patient and motivated by the significant fee Theodore Walsh had offered, and by mid-November he had traced Violet Cooper to Denver, then to Garnet Creek, and was making preparations to travel north. But none of that was visible yet to anyone in the valley, and so November moved forward in its cold and beautiful way, and Violet Cooper and Hugh Monroe continued their careful dance around each other. The moment things changed, truly changed, arrived on a Wednesday evening in the last week of November. She had been in the kitchen after supper cleaning up, and she had knocked a jar of preserved peaches off the shelf reaching for the coffee tin, and it had shattered on the floor, and the sound had brought Hugh in from the sitting room immediately, which told her something about his alertness, his readiness to respond to a sound that might mean something was wrong. "Are you hurt?" he said, scanning her quickly. "No, just clumsy. I'm sorry about the peaches." "I don't care about the peaches," he said. "Don't move, there's glass everywhere." He got the broom and she stood still in the middle of the kitchen while he swept the glass up around her with the focused efficiency of a man who was good at doing necessary things. And when he was finished, he looked up at her and they were closer than they had been before, closer than they had been at any point since she arrived. And the kitchen was small and warm and the lamp was throwing everything in amber light and neither of them moved for a moment. "Hugh," she said. "Yes," he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, not just the glass, for letting me be here." He was quiet. She watched something move through his expression, something old and complicated fighting with something newer and simpler. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I do," she said, "because you didn't have to. You could have looked at me on that first morning and said no." "I know." "Why didn't you?" He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Because you looked like someone who had been saying yes to the wrong things for a long time and no one had ever made room for what you actually needed." Violet Cooper, who had been managed and organized and planned for and worried over and followed across 3 states by people who thought they knew what was best for her, stood in Hugh Monroe's kitchen and felt those words land somewhere inside her that had been empty for so long she had stopped checking it. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of another person in 4 years, and she was not going to start now. But her eyes brightened and she said, very quietly, "That's the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in quite some time. I have a talent for observing things from the outside," he said. He moved to put the broom away and added, without quite looking at her, "I'm not always as good at applying the same logic to myself." "None of us are," she said. He went back to the sitting room and she finished the kitchen and they did not speak again that night, but the air between them had changed. Something had been admitted, not yet named but admitted, the way you admit a person to a room before you've offered them a chair. December arrived. The cold that came with it was not the regular cold of November, the kind you could negotiate with. It was the high Rocky Mountain winter cold that meant business, the temperatures dropping below 0 at night and not climbing much above it in the day, the snow pack deepening, the creek at the edge of the pasture icing over solid. The mountains that ringed the valley became abstract white shapes, barely distinguishable from the sky. Court and Dale Simmons finished out their winter duties and rode back to their own place 7 miles south, which was the arrangement, leaving the ranch to Hugh Monroe and his own considerable self-sufficiency. The cattle were brought to the winter pasture where they could be managed from the barn. The hay stores were solid. The wood pile was deep and well seasoned. Hugh Monroe was a man who prepared, which Violet took note of, because men who prepared were men who planned to still be standing when things got hard. She was in the kitchen on a morning in the first week of December when she heard the buckboard coming up the road and went to the window and saw that it was not coming from town but from the east, from the direction of the mountain pass, which in December was either brave or foolish. The man driving it was someone she did not recognize. Her stomach dropped. She stepped back from the window and stood very still and used the skills she had developed over the past several months of being a woman who was being looked for. She thought about what she knew and what she did not know and what to do with both. Hugh was in the barn. The wagon pulled up to the house. Violet went to the door before the man could knock because she wanted to control the encounter from the beginning. He was medium height, compact, with a flat-brimmed hat and a coat that was good quality but had travel dust on it. And he had the particular stillness of someone who was very accustomed to watching people without appearing to. He was, she understood immediately and with a cold certainty, the man Theodore Walsh had sent to find her. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking for a schoolteacher named Violet Cooper. I was told in town she might be working out this way." "Who's asking?" she said. "Desmond Fry," he said. "I'm conducting an inquiry on behalf of a family member who has been concerned about Miss Cooper's welfare." He was good at this. He made it sound almost reasonable. He made it sound like care instead of what it was, which was a retrieval operation. "I don't know anyone by that name," Violet said. She kept her voice level and her expression politely blank. "I'm afraid you've had a long ride for nothing." Desmond Fry looked at her with those watching eyes and she could see him making calculations behind them. "You wouldn't happen to be her yourself, would you?" he said. "You match the description fairly well." "I think you'll find a lot of women in Wyoming territory match a fairly general description," she said. "I'm sorry I can't be more help." There was a sound behind her, boots on the kitchen floor, and Hugh Monroe came through the door and stood at her shoulder without touching her, his presence large and deliberate and clear. "Something I can help you with," Hugh said. His voice was entirely even, not threatening, not loud, not performatively aggressive. Just the voice of a man who was the owner of the land this other man was standing on and who would like an explanation. Desmond Fry looked at Hugh and then at Violet and back at Hugh, and the calculations in his eyes shifted. "Just looking for someone," he said. "She told you she doesn't know them," Hugh said. "That's all the answer you're going to get here." Fry held the moment for a breath. Then he touched his hat and said he appreciated the time, and turned his wagon around and went back down the road toward town. Violet turned and walked back into the kitchen and sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the surface in front of her and breathed. Hugh Monroe sat down across from her, the same position they had been in on her first morning here, the same 2 cups of coffee between them, and waited. After a moment she said, "I owe you an explanation." "You owe me the truth if you want to tell it," he said. "You don't owe me anything beyond that." So she told him the truth, all of it. Indiana and her father's death and Theodore Walsh's pursuit, and her brother-in-law's quiet capitulation to it, because Theodore Walsh was a man of means, and her sister had 3 children, and practicality has its own kind of gravity. She told him about Kansas City and Denver, and the teaching advertisement, and the note on the door, and all the miles between where she had been and where she was sitting right now. She told him with the flat, careful voice she used when she was telling a truth that cost her something. Hugh Monroe listened. He did not interrupt. He did not make a face of shock or sympathy or any of the expressions people make when they want to demonstrate that they are listening without quite managing to actually listen. He just sat there in the morning light and heard her. When she finished, there was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "Walsh is a man of money," he said finally. "This Fry won't stop at one conversation. I know. He'll go back to town and ask around and people will talk. Arlo Prout will not hold his tongue for long. I know that too." Hugh was quiet again, thinking in that methodical way he had. "Then, do you have any legal obligation to this Walsh? Any contract or formal agreement?" "Nothing I signed," Violet said. "Only what others agreed to on my behalf without asking me." "Then he has no enforceable claim," Hugh said. "In the territory of Wyoming, a woman is not property regardless of what arrangements her family made without her consent." Violet looked at him. "You know territorial law." "I read the survey reports," he said. "And everything else I can find." He paused. "Wyoming gave women the right to vote in 1869. It was the first territory to do so. There is more protection here for a woman who chooses her own course than in most places." "I didn't know that," she said. She filed it away beside everything else she was learning about Hugh Monroe, this man who read everything and said little and watched with a precision that missed almost nothing. "Fry will be back," Hugh said. "Most likely with a different approach. He may try to speak to you in town. Or he may just send word to Walsh of my location and Walsh may come himself," Violet said. "Has Walsh ever been physical with you?" The question was asked with complete stillness, not with anger but with the particular quality of a man who is asking because the answer will determine what he does next. "No," she said. "He is not that kind of man. He is the kind who believes he is too reasonable to be refused, which is its own kind of problem." "That kind is harder in some ways," Hugh said. "Yes," Violet agreed. He got up and refilled both their cups and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the road where Desmond Fry's wagon had gone. "You should know," he said, not turning around, "that this is your home as long as you want it to be. No one is going to come onto this land and remove you from it against your will. That is not a thing I will allow." Violet Cooper sat at Hugh Monroe's kitchen table and looked at the broad line of his shoulders against the window and the snow-covered land beyond, and thought about what it meant to be in the right place. Not the place you expected, not the place that anyone else had planned for you, but the right place, the one that had your particular shape to it, that made room for you in ways you had given up hoping for. "Thank you, Hugh," she said. He turned then and looked at her and said nothing, but his eyes held something that she was getting better at reading, something warm and a little helpless and very, very real. Desmond Fry came back 3 days later, but he did not come to the ranch. He caught Violet in town at the general store on a Thursday morning when she was alone with the buckboard, and he was polite and persistent and explicit in a way he had not been the first time. He told her that Theodore Walsh was a patient man and a determined one, and that the world was not so large that a woman could successfully disappear into it, particularly when that woman had a sister and a niece and nephews who might inadvertently be made uncomfortable by the ongoing search. It was not a threat. It was made to sound like concern, but it was absolutely a threat. Violet looked at Desmond Fry and said, "Tell Mr. Walsh that I have made my choice and that it is final, and that if he continues this pursuit, I will consult with the territorial authorities about the appropriateness of hiring a man to follow an adult woman across state lines without her consent." Fry's expression flickered. He had not, she could tell, expected that response. "I'll pass it along," he said. He left town 2 days later, which she heard from Ruth Hanby, who heard from her husband, who had the peculiarly good information network that rural pastors tend to develop. Whether Fry went back to Theodore Walsh to report or simply moved on to his next engagement, Violet did not know, but the immediate pressure lifted and she could breathe again. She told Hugh that evening and he nodded and said good and asked if she was all right, and she said she was, and he asked if she wanted more coffee and she said yes, and that was that, except that it was not that at all. Because Violet lay awake that night in her room on the second floor and listened to the wind around the eaves and thought about the fact that Hugh Monroe had said she could stay as long as she wanted and had stood at her shoulder in that doorway and had been quietly, completely in her corner without being asked and without requiring anything in return. And she thought about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not looking, and she understood that she was deeply, inconveniently, absolutely in love with this man. This was a problem, not because she did not want to be in love with him, but because he was a man who was still carrying a grief that he wore as carefully as a second skin, a man who had told her without quite saying it that he had not been able to save his wife, and that he had never quite found a way to forgive himself for it. And she did not know if there was room in that grief for something new, and she did not want to be wrong about it. Being wrong about it at this point would cost her more than she could afford. She was not the only one awake. Downstairs, Hugh Monroe sat by the fire with a book open on his knee that he had not read a single word of in the past hour, and he was thinking about Violet Cooper's face in that moment in town, what she must have looked like standing in front of Desmond Fry's particular kind of soft menace, and refusing to yield. And he was thinking about the way she had told him the story of her life and had not asked for his pity, had not softened it to make herself more appealing or more pitiable, had just given him the facts and let him think what he liked, which was the most honest thing he had ever seen a person do. And he was thinking that the house felt like a house again in a way that it had not felt in 3 years, and he was thinking that he was terrified. He was terrified because he knew exactly what he was feeling, and he was not at all certain it was a safe thing to feel. He had loved his wife. She had been a good woman and a kind one, and she had died in that bedroom upstairs while he was in the north pasture checking a fence line, and he had come home to find her gone, and the house silent, and the particular quality of emptiness that is not the absence of people, but the absence of the specific person who made the place what it was. He had built his survival around a belief that he would not put himself in that position again, that he would not need someone that way again. He was failing at this. The snow came down harder in the second week of December. The temperatures fell to places that the thermometer outside the kitchen door registered with the grim impassivity of something that had simply stopped being surprised. The passes closed in earnest, the roads becoming theoretical, and Garnet Creek settled into the deep winter isolation that its residents were well prepared for, and that had its own interior quality, a sense of the world having drawn its borders close. They were alone in the house, the two of them, for long, uninterrupted days. They talked. Really talked, in the way that can only happen when two people have been careful with each other long enough that the caution begins to feel like more trouble than the openness. Hugh told her about growing up in Missouri, the son of a farmer who had survived the border wars and come out of them changed in ways he never quite recovered from. He told her about coming west in 1875 with his wife, Clara, and the years of building the ranch from raw land, and the good years, the years when things worked, and then the 4 days of fever that had taken everything. He did not tell it with self-pity. He told it with the same flat, accurate honesty that Violet had used to tell her own story, and she recognized the quality of it and received it the same way he had received hers, not with performance, but with real attention. She told him about her father, who had been a schoolteacher himself, and had believed profoundly and without reservation that his daughter's intelligence was a gift and not a liability, which had made her childhood a bright place even though money was always scarce. She told him about the Indiana winters and the way her father had read to her every night until she was old enough to read better than him, and how they had laughed about this, and how she still missed that laugh with the specific, physical grief of missing something irreplaceable. Hugh listened and then said, he would have approved of Wyoming. He would have approved of you, Violet said, and then wished briefly that she had held that back because it was too close to an admission, but Hugh's expression was so entirely without strategy that she was glad she had said it. Tell me more about him, Hugh said. So she did. One evening in the middle of December after supper, Hugh brought out a chessboard. Violet had not played since her father died. She told him this. He told her he had not played since Clara died, who had beaten him reliably at least twice out of 3 games, a fact he delivered with the combination of pride and rueful amusement of a man who had been very happy being outplayed. They sat at the kitchen table with the chess pieces between them and played until nearly midnight, and Violet won the first game and Hugh won the second, and they did not finish the third because they were talking too much, arguing cheerfully about a point in Darwin that they had both reached different conclusions on, and by the time they noticed the time the fire had burned to coals, and they were both laughing. Hugh Monroe's laugh was not something she had heard at length before. It arrived fully, involuntarily, and transformed his face in ways she found herself wanting to see repeatedly. She sat across from him in the lamplight and the warm remains of the fire and thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, that this was the most purely happy she had felt since her father died. Later, after she had gone upstairs, Hugh sat by the cooling fire for a long time. Then he went to the mantel and looked at the photograph of Clara. It was her wedding photograph, the two of them young and formal and bright-eyed. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "I think I'm going to be all right," and was not entirely sure who he was saying it to. Christmas approached. Neither of them had acknowledged it much, but the fact of it was present in the way Violet began adding small preparations to her daily work, in the way she came back from a trip to town with nutmeg and dried fruit, in the way she put a pine bough on the mantel. 4 days before Christmas, Hugh came back from the barn with a small spruce tree he had cut and brought inside, standing it up in the corner of the sitting room with a solemnity that was entirely genuine, and Violet looked at it and felt the tight thing in her chest that she usually kept firmly managed loosened just enough that she had to turn away and look at the window for a moment. "I don't have ornaments," he said. "Nothing to put on it." "We can make some," she said. So they spent the evening at the table with scraps of ribbon and bits of wire and the small pine cones she had been collecting off the porch, making decorations with the focused, good-natured industry of 2 people who have found an excuse to sit close together and take their time with a simple thing. It was during this, with Violet bent over a small cone she was threading with ribbon and Hugh watching her hands work and not pretending otherwise, that he said, "I need to tell you something." She looked up. His expression was careful and open at the same time. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this for a while now," he said. "And I think the problem is that I'm waiting for a version of it that is less than it is, because the version that is actually true feels like more than I have the right to." She set down the pine cone. "I care about you," he said, "considerably, in ways that have nothing to do with you being here or useful or convenient, in ways that would be exactly the same if you were anywhere. And I am aware that you came here under circumstances that were difficult and that you may not be looking for this, and I don't want to make you uncomfortable in your own home." "My own home," she repeated softly. "Yes," he said. And then, with the same complete simplicity with which he had said everything true, "That's what it is. Whatever happens, that's what it is." Violet Cooper had spent years surrounded by people who wanted things from her or for her or about her, who spoke of her future as something they were managing on her behalf. She had spent years being very careful and very controlled and very well defended. She sat in Hugh Monroe's sitting room with a pine cone in her hand and the Christmas tree in the corner and the snow falling outside the window, and she made the most deliberate decision she had made in 4 years. She stopped being careful. "Hugh," she said, "I have been in love with you since the morning in November when you told me. I looked like someone who had been saying yes to the wrong things, and no one had made room for what I needed. I have been trying very hard not to say so because you are a man who has been hurt badly, and I didn't want to ask for more than you were able to give. But if you're telling me you have room, then I want you to know that I have absolutely no interest in being anywhere other than here." Hugh Monroe looked at her across the table with those gray eyes that had gone very bright and said nothing for the span of several heartbeats. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. His hand was large and roughened from work and very warm, and he held hers with a gentleness that was in no way tentative, because it was not the gentleness of uncertainty. It was the gentleness of a man who was being careful with something he valued. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. "All right," he said and smiled, and this time the smile was not brief. Christmas came and went in the slow, luminous way of deep winter holidays in isolated country, marked by good food and the reading aloud of Dickens by the fire, and a long walk in the snow on Christmas morning that ended with both of them with snow in their hair, and their breath fogging in the still cold air, and Violet laughing at something Hugh said, and Hugh watching her laugh and being entirely certain, in the bone-deep way of real certainty rather than hopeful certainty, that this was where he was supposed to be. January arrived with temperatures that pushed the thermometer below what it was designed to record, and a wind off the peaks that was pure and merciless, and filled the days with the necessary work of survival, keeping the animals alive, keeping the fires going, keeping the pipes from freezing. It was demanding work, and they did it together, side by side, without complaint, and with a mutual competence that deepened something between them that was already considerable. There was a night in January when the temperature outside was what the almanac would later record as 32 degrees below zero, which was a number that stops being weather and starts being a force of nature. And the house held its warmth by the stubborn grace of good construction and a well-fed stove. And they sat together on the narrow settee before the fire with a quilt over both of them and Violet's head against Hugh's shoulder, and the whole world beyond the glass reduced to a howling dark. And it was the safest and most complete that either of them had felt in years. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," Violet said. Hugh was quiet for a moment. "When Clara died," he said carefully, "the hardest thing wasn't the grief. The hardest thing was being angry at her for leaving. I knew it wasn't fair. I knew she didn't choose it. But there was this anger underneath the grief that I couldn't reach and couldn't name and couldn't do anything with, and I thought for a long time that it made me a bad person." Violet did not say that it did not make him a bad person. She said, "What did you do with it?" "I worked," he said. "I worked until there wasn't room for anything else. I came out here and I built things and I fixed things, and I was alone, and I told myself that was what I had chosen." "But you hadn't," she said. "No," he said. "I had just run out of other ideas." She took his hand under the quilt and held it. "Violet," he said, "yes. I'm glad you knocked on my door." She turned her head to look at him. "I'm glad you opened it." He kissed her then, or she kissed him. It was one of those things that begins between two people simultaneously, so that it is not possible to say who moved first. It was simply something that happened between them, with the inevitability of the season changing, of water finding its level, of two things that belong together coming to rest in the correct configuration. It was not a desperate kiss. It was not the frantic kind that speaks of urgency and fear. It was the kind that speaks of certainty, of two people who have spent enough time arriving at this point that the moment of arrival has a weight to it, a rightness, a sense of something being completed rather than merely begun. February brought a thaw that lasted almost a week, one of those improbable warm spells that the Rocky Mountain winter occasionally produces to remind you that it is not entirely without mercy. And the snow on the south-facing slopes softened, and the creek ran audibly under its ice, and the horses were restless in the barn and wanted to be out. Hugh took Violet riding on the third day of the thaw, up through the lower timber to a place he knew on a south-facing ridge where the snow was thin, and the view opened out over the entire valley, with the town visible as a small cluster of smoke columns in the middle of the white. They sat their horses side by side and looked at it. "My father would have loved this," Violet said. "He would have wanted to survey every foot of it," Hugh said. "He had listened well. He always listened well." "He would have wanted to know the name of every peak," Violet agreed. "I know most of them," Hugh said. Some I gave my own names to before I learned the real ones. That one there I called the Old Man because the ridgeline has a profile that looks like a sleeping face if you catch it in the right light. Does it still look like that now that you know its real name? More so, he said. A thing that looks true usually keeps looking true. She looked at him across the space between their horses. He was looking out at the valley with that particular expression of his, the one that was partly contentment and partly something older and more careful, and the February sun was on his face, and she thought he was the finest-looking man she had ever been in the company of and also the finest man, full stop, and that these two things coming together in the same person was more than she had ever expected from her own life. "Hugh," she said. He looked at her. "I want to stay," she said. "Not just through the cold. I want to stay through everything." He looked at her for a long moment. The valley lay below them, white and vast and full of the particular silence of open country. The horses breathed clouds of vapor into the warming air. "Yes," he said, and then, with the directness that was the thing she had first identified and would love in him the longest, "I want you to stay through everything. I want everything. I want to marry you, Violet, if you'll have me. I want to build this life with you. I want this to be the thing we both chose." She felt the tears arrive, which she had promised herself she would not do, and then understood that there was no version of this moment in which she was not going to cry, and that it was all right. It was entirely all right. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." He rode his horse close enough to hers and reached over and held her face in both his hands and looked at her with those gray eyes that had gone completely open. No walls, no careful management, just Hugh Monroe looking at her with everything he had. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since the morning you came to my door with a teaching certificate and $4 and stood in my kitchen without asking for anything more than what was fair. I love you," she said. "I have loved you since you brought me bread on a plate in the barn because I forgot to call you in for supper." "I brought your supper to the barn," he corrected, smiling. "I know," she said. "That's what I said." He laughed, and she laughed, and the horses shifted beneath them, and the valley was very beautiful, and the winter was beginning its long retreat toward spring. They were married in Garnet Creek on the 14th of March, 1883, in the church with the cracked bell that rang its flat, fractured note over the valley as if it had been saving its particular voice for precisely this occasion. Pastor Hanby performed the ceremony, and Ruth Hanby stood in the first pew with her handkerchief ready, and a smile of deep satisfaction on her face, because she had known since the second week of November that this was how it was going to go, and she had been patient about it, and she felt vindicated. Ellis Carr was Hugh's witness, having become over the winter one of Hugh's closest friends, the kind of friendship that forms between men who respect each other's competence and share a reading habit. Court Simmons and his brother Dale rode in for the occasion, and Court sat in the back and was gruff, and moved only the absolute necessary amount. But he was there, which Violet correctly interpreted as a form of approval. Violet wore a dress of dark blue wool that she had spent 3 weeks making, quietly, in the evenings, with material she had ordered from the store in town, and the color of it made her dark hair and dark eyes luminous. Hugh wore his good coat and a clean white shirt, and looked at her when she came down the aisle of the church, with such unguarded and total adoration that Ruth Hanby's handkerchief was deployed before the ceremony had properly begun. The reception was in the church hall, and there was venison and bread and dried apple cake, and a fiddle player named Cooper Banks, no relation to Violet, who played with the energetic enthusiasm of someone who knows exactly 2 keys, but knows them extremely well, and the afternoon was long and warm and full. That night, the first night of their married life, Hugh carried her over the threshold of the ranch house, as if he had been planning to do this specific thing with great care, and Violet laughed and held onto his neck, and said she was perfectly capable of walking, and he said he was aware of that and kept walking. He had put a fire in the bedroom fireplace, and there were fresh flowers, dried ones, the kind you could get in winter, in a jar on the windowsill that she knew had cost him a special trip to town and some creativity with what was available in March. And she looked at those flowers and thought, with a fullness that she was not sure she had words adequate to, that she was completely and permanently home. Spring came the way Wyoming spring comes, reluctantly and in fragments, a warm week followed by a hard frost, the grass arriving in tentative green patches that the cattle found immediately, the creek running high and noisy with snowmelt. The passes opened and the road to Garnet Creek was clear, and the world expanded again after its long winter compression. With the spring came also a letter, which arrived in April and was from Theodore Walsh. Violet opened it without fear, because fear was no longer her posture toward this situation, and read it standing at the kitchen table. Hugh came in while she was reading it and saw her expression and said nothing, just stood and waited. It was a formal letter, composed with the assistance of someone who knew a great deal about the language of legal documentation. It acknowledged that Violet had contracted a marriage in Wyoming territory. It expressed in language so carefully legal that it barely resembled emotion that this was not the outcome Walsh had intended. It did not threaten. It was, in its cold way, a retreat. At the bottom, below the formal language in a different hand that was almost certainly Walsh's own, was a single sentence that said, "I hope you find what you were looking for." Violet showed it to Hugh. He read it and then set it down and said, "Does he mean it?" "I think he almost does," she said. "I think he's a man who knows, on some level, that he was wrong. He just won't ever be able to say so in plain language." "Most men like that can't," Hugh said. She wrote back. She kept it short and without cruelty, and she said only that she had found exactly what she was looking for, and that she wished him well with complete sincerity. Then she set the letter in the pile for town and moved on. The spring brought also new calves, 11 of them in 3 weeks, and Hugh was in the barn at odd hours and sometimes through the night checking on the animals. And Violet got into the habit of bringing coffee to the barn in the small hours when she woke and found his side of the bed empty. And they developed a whole companionate life in the barn in the middle of dark spring nights. The warmth of the animals around them, the smell of fresh straw and coffee. Talking about everything, and nothing with the ease of two people who have run out of subjects to be nervous about. Summer came in green and enormous, the valley filling with the particular richness of mountain country in the warm months, wildflowers on every hillside and the sky a blue so deep it was almost dark. And Violet went about her days with the settled, productive happiness of a person whose life has found its correct shape. She resumed teaching. Not through the schoolhouse, which remained under the mayor's daughter's stewardship, but at the kitchen table, first with 3 children from neighboring ranches whose parents were grateful, and whose presence filled the house with a noise and energy that Violet found she had deeply missed. By August she had 7 students, and Hugh built a proper room onto the east side of the house for the purpose, a good room with large windows on the south and west sides for the light, and Violet stood in it on the morning it was finished and felt something close to the emotion she had felt on their wedding day. "It needs a name," Hugh said, standing in the doorway with sawdust on his hands. "What kind of name?" "All good rooms have names." Violet thought for a moment. "The schoolroom." "That's honest," he said. "You've been a good influence," she told him. He smiled, that complete smile she had watched arrive for the first time at a chess game in December and had been watching ever since, and went back to the barn. By September, Violet knew she was expecting a child. She told Hugh on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting across the table from him, the same table where everything between them had begun, and his face went through several things in rapid sequence, all of them legible and all of them wonderful to witness. Surprise, something almost like fear. And then, rising through everything else, a joy so complete and undiluted that it was the most openly happy she had ever seen him. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Are you well?" he said. "How long have you known? Are you all right?" 2 weeks. "Yes, yes," she said, matching his questions in order. "I am very well." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment, Then he said against her knuckles, "Thank you. You were somewhat involved," she said. "I mean," he said, looking up at her, "for everything, for coming here, for staying." Violet smiled at him. "You told me I could stay through everything," she said. "I meant it," he said, "every word of it." The winter of 1883 came again, the second winter, and it was cold in the way that Wyoming winters are reliably cold. But it was not the same kind of cold as the first one had been, because now the house was a different thing entirely. It was warm in every sense of the word, warm with fire and with the smell of cooking, and with 7 children arriving 3 mornings a week for lessons, and with the specific warmth that a house generates when the people inside it are genuinely glad to be in it together. Violet expanded with the pregnancy through the autumn, and into the winter with the pragmatic good cheer that she applied to most situations, continuing to teach and to run the house, and to walk out with Hugh in the evenings when the weather allowed and to play chess, though she was beating him more often now, and attributed this to the fact that having a baby was making her smarter, which was not medically documented, but which Hugh was not prepared to argue against. She read everything she could find about childbirth and infant care, which was a characteristic Violet response to an approaching challenge, and she had long conversations with Ellis Carr, who was an excellent doctor and who took her questions seriously, and answered them with the same thoroughness with which she asked them. She spoke with Ruth Hanby, who had 3 children of her own and knew what was useful knowledge and what was simply anxiety dressed up in practical language. Hugh, who did not discuss his fears, showed them in the way he showed most things, through action, through thoroughness, through the careful preparation of a man who had learned the hard way what it meant to be caught unready. He spoke with Ellis Carr. He made certain there was a good stock of clean cloth and the other necessary provisions. He made certain the bedroom was warm and well organized, and that his horse could be saddled in under 2 minutes. He lay awake some nights with his hand on Violet's round belly, and she would feel him awake and put her hand over his, and they would both lie in the dark and not speak, because some things are more purely communicated without words. The baby arrived on the 14th of February, 1884, which was their first wedding anniversary, which was the kind of timing that a person cannot plan, and that feels therefore like something more than coincidence. It was a boy, solid and loud, and possessed from the first hour of a determination to make his presence known to the greatest possible radius, and Violet looked at him with the exhausted, absolute wonder of a new mother, and then looked at Hugh, who was sitting at the edge of the bed with his son in his arms, and whose face was doing something that she had no word for because there was no word adequate to describe the expression of a man who has lost everything and been given back more than he lost. "He needs a name," Hugh said very quietly, looking down at the baby. "I was thinking Samuel," Violet said. "For my father." Hugh looked up at her. "Samuel Monroe," he said, testing it. "That's a good strong name." "He's a good strong baby," she said. Hugh looked back down at his son. Samuel Monroe, 6 days old and already conducting a thorough audit of the available faces in his vicinity, fixed his dark, unfocused gaze somewhere in the general direction of his father's face, and Hugh Monroe, who had survived loss and silence and 3 years of deliberate solitude, made a sound that was purely involuntary and purely joyful, and then said to the baby and to Violet and to whoever else might be listening, "We're going to be all right." "We are," Violet said. "We are absolutely going to be all right." Spring of 1884 was busy in every dimension. Samuel Monroe was an active and opinionated infant who communicated his preferences with impressive clarity and slept in manageable but unpredictable patterns that kept both his parents in a pleasant state of mild exhaustion. The school continued with 8 students by March, as 2 new families had come into the valley over the winter, and one of them had 4 children who needed educating urgently. Hugh finished the addition to the schoolroom that provided better storage for Violet's growing collection of books, which she had been ordering from Denver, with the systematic intent of building a real library. Court Simmons, who had been watching the transformation of the Monroe Ranch with the sideways interest of a man who did not easily admit that things pleased him. Arrived one April afternoon with a crate of supplies that no one had ordered and a blanket of the good wool kind for the baby that he set on the kitchen table without comment, and then said he had heard from Dale that there were some men looking at the available land in the southeastern corner of the valley, and that Hugh should probably speak to the land office, because there were some right-of-way questions that needed addressing before the wrong kind of neighbor moved in. It was, Violet understood, the longest speech Court Simmons had made in any room she had been in. She thanked him for the blanket and he went red-faced and said it was nothing and left. "He likes you," Hugh told her. "He likes the baby," Violet said. "He likes you. He showed Dale the blanket 3 times before he brought it over. Dale told me." Violet laughed, the full, real laugh that Hugh had been trying to find ways to produce since the first chess game. He watched her laugh and felt the same thing he always felt when he watched her laugh, which was something in the range of profound gratitude combined with a disbelief so comfortable it no longer troubled him. Summer came again. The students were let out for the harvest season in August, and Violet turned her considerable energy to projects around the ranch, including a kitchen garden that she had been planning in theoretical form all winter and executed with a thoroughness that surprised even Hugh, who was accustomed to her thoroughness. She grew what was feasible in Wyoming at altitude: potatoes and carrots and beans and the hardier of the greens, and the garden became a feature of daily life that Samuel, old enough now to be transported in a sling on his mother's back, seemed to find entirely fascinating and to have strong opinions about. Hugh watched his son in the kitchen garden and thought about the future in the way he had stopped thinking about it for 3 years and had now started again, a future that was specific and detailed and full, with this child and this woman and this place and more, he hoped, to come. In August he expanded the barn. In September, Violet told him she was expecting their second child. She told him in the kitchen garden with Samuel asleep in the sling, and Hugh looked at her in the late afternoon light with the mountains behind her and said, with the direct simplicity that was his most consistent quality, "Good. I want 6. 6, she said. "At least," he said. "Let's discuss this further when we've successfully gotten through 2, she said. "Reasonable," he said, and kissed her in the kitchen garden while their son slept between them, which was exactly the right thing to do. The second winter came and was milder than the first and harder than the second and perfectly navigable, which was the nature of Wyoming winters, every one of them different, all of them requiring the kind of flexible resilience that a person develops only by actually living through them. Violet was large with the second pregnancy by November and continued teaching until Christmas, at which point Ellis Carr, with the gentle firmness of a good doctor who knew his patient well, suggested she rest for the remainder of the term. She rested. She read. She played chess with Hugh and won 3 games to his 1, which she was extremely pleased about. She and Samuel had long conversations that were one-sided in the linguistic sense, but were perfectly balanced in terms of mutual investment. Samuel communicating his position on all subjects with great animation, and Violet responding, with the full attention she gave to everyone who spoke to her honestly. Hugh built a cradle for the new baby, a real one, with carved wooden runners that he worked on in the evenings by lamplight, with a patience and care that Violet observed from across the room with the warm, private happiness of someone watching a person they love do something that reveals them. The second baby arrived in March of 1885, a girl this time, with Violet's dark eyes and what appeared from the first hour to be Hugh Monroe's calm determination, expressed in an infant who nursed efficiently, slept predictably, and regarded the world from the beginning with the assessing, thoughtful gaze of someone taking notes. "Clara," Violet said when Hugh had the baby in his arms and was looking at her with that same expression she had seen on his face with Samuel, that expression she still had no word for. Hugh looked up. Something moved through his face. "You'd call her that," "If it's right for you," Violet said, "and I believe it is, Clara Monroe, a name for someone who should be remembered." Hugh looked back at the baby. His jaw worked once. Then he said very quietly, "It's right." Clara Monroe was indeed right in virtually every way from the beginning. A calm and decisive child who knew what she wanted and went about getting it with a minimum of drama. She and Samuel, who was 14 months her senior, formed from an early age the kind of sibling alliance that is based on mutual recognition and becomes formidable in proportion to the child-rearing challenge it represents. Violet expanded the school in the fall of 1885 to include a formal afternoon session after the morning lessons, offering what she called a reading circle that was open to adults as well as children, which began with 5 participants and grew to 14 by the following spring. The ranch house on the eastern edge of the valley had become, without anyone planning it, a small educational and community institution, and Violet Cooper Monroe, who had arrived in Garnet Creek with a carpetbag and a teaching certificate and $4.30, had in 3 years built the thing that had been promised her and taken away from her when she first arrived. Hugh watched this happen with the same appreciation with which he watched everything she did, that attentive appreciation that had been present from the beginning and had never diminished because it was not based on novelty but on genuine recognition. He told her one evening after the last of the reading circle had gone home and the children were in bed and they were in the kitchen together in the particular quiet of an ending day, "You know what you have done here, don't you?" "Made supper," she said deliberately. "Built something," he said. "You came here looking for a position and you created the thing that the position was supposed to be." She looked at him. "We built something," she said. "All of it, together." He came around the table to her then and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with those gray eyes that she knew so well now that she could read every register they moved through, and he said, "I need you to know that I am aware every day of how much I have that I thought I had lost forever. I need you to know that I do not take a single part of it for granted." "I know," she said. "I see it, in how you are." "Good," he said. "I want you to always see it." She put her hands over his. "I will always see it," she said, "and I need you to know the same from me. I ran from one life and arrived in yours and found that yours was the one that fit. I wouldn't go back for anything in the world." He kissed her then, slowly, and with the full attention of a man who is not distracted, because nothing in the universe at that moment is competing for his attention, and she kissed him back the same way. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear and cold, and the stars were so thick over the valley that they barely resembled individual things, more like a continuous luminous field. And the mountains were dark shapes against the sky, permanent and ancient and indifferent to all human complication, except in the sense that their beauty made everything that happened beneath them feel significant. In the spring of 1886, Garnet Creek finally got its railroad spur. It arrived from the south in a great, productive chaos of track laying and survey work and the various commerce that follows industrial development. And the town swelled and changed and acquired 3 new businesses and a new school building that the town council voted to fund, and that required a school teacher. They offered the position to Violet Monroe. She accepted it on the condition that it included a salary commensurate with her experience and a proper teaching library, both of which the council, somewhat to their own surprise, agreed to, because Violet Cooper Monroe had spent 3 years demonstrating what an educated, competent, thoroughly prepared woman could do in a community that gave her room, and the evidence was difficult to argue with. She continued to teach the afternoon reading circle at the ranch. She walked with Hugh in the evenings when the weather allowed, and they talked about everything, and continued to disagree productively about Darwin and Thoreau, and to agree about Dickens. Samuel, now 2 years old and in possession of strong views about the correct categorization of all local birds, accompanied them on the walks with the focused, stomping energy of a small boy who has a great deal of ground to cover. Clara, 18 months old and already composing a list of grievances to be reviewed at supper, rode on her father's shoulders and patted his head with the proprietary satisfaction of a child who knows what belongs to her. That fall, Hugh Monroe and Ellis Carr and 3 other men from the valley signed a petition to the Wyoming Territorial Legislature requesting formal recognition of the Garnet Creek Schoolhouse as a public institution entitled to territorial funding. They won the petition in the spring of 1887, which meant a real building, real resources, and a real salary, and the victory was quiet and complete and changed the lives of every child in the valley for years to come. On the day the news arrived by telegraph, Hugh read the message and brought it to Violet in the schoolroom where she was teaching 6 children the multiplication tables with a combination of rigor and humor that was entirely characteristic. And he stood in the doorway and waited for her to finish the lesson, which she did with a patience that made him love her even more than he already did. And then he showed her the telegram. She read it. She looked up at him. "We did that," he said. "The children did that," she said. "We just showed up consistently." "That's usually enough," he said. She folded the telegram and kept it. It went into the box under the bed where she kept the things that mattered to her. The letter from her father that she had been carrying since he died, the teaching certificate, the note Hugh had left on the plate the night she brought his supper to the barn, the pressed flower from their first spring ride on the ridge. A life, documented in small papers and small moments, adding up to something vast. In the fall of 1887, their 3rd child arrived, a boy they named Robert, who came into the world roaring and maintained that volume for approximately the first 6 months of his life, after which he settled into a cheerful and adventurous disposition that kept both his parents and his siblings in a state of alert monitoring. He was the image of his father from the first week, dark hair and gray eyes and the long, calm bones of a man who would one day be large, and Hugh held him and looked at him and said, "3," with a quiet satisfaction that needed no elaboration. "You said you wanted 6, Violet reminded him. "I was being optimistic," he said. "You're never optimistic," she said. "You're precise. 6 was a precise number." He looked at her with those eyes. "Then we'd better keep working," he said. She laughed and he laughed, and Robert Monroe, 7 days old and already curious about the acoustics of laughter, widened his eyes at the sound. The winter of 1887 was the winter that tested the whole territory. It was the winter that history would later call the Big Die-Up, that catastrophic combination of drought followed by blizzard, followed by more blizzard, that destroyed the open-range cattle industry across Wyoming and Montana and left ranchmen who had staked everything on free-range grazing with nothing. The Monroe Ranch, which was smaller and more carefully managed, with sheltered winter pasture and adequate hay stores and cattle that were managed rather than simply left to fend for themselves, survived with losses that were significant but not fatal. Other ranchers nearby lost everything, or near enough that the difference hardly mattered. Hugh spent that winter working 16-hour days and helping where he could, lending hay and labor to neighbors whose situations were desperate, because this was what he understood a community to be, not an arrangement of self-interest but a mutual commitment to collective survival. Violet kept the school running through the coldest weeks with the students whose families could safely send them, and she organized what was in effect a community kitchen, 3 days a week in the church hall, cooking and distributing food to families who were struggling, with the quiet, practical efficiency of someone who understands that a crisis is best addressed by doing the next necessary thing, without pausing to assess the scale of the overall disaster. Ruth Hanby worked beside her in those cold months and said once, putting bread out to cool on a freezing morning in January, "You know, you're the best thing that has happened to this town." "Hugh would say the school is the best thing," Violet said. "Hugh would say you are," Ruth said. "But he's too much of a gentleman to say it to me." Violet smiled. "He says it to me," she said. "Good," Ruth Hanby said. "A man should. Spring came eventually, as it always does, indifferent to the damage it is arriving to survey, and the valley came back to life in the undefeated animal way of spring in country that has been genuinely hard used. The grass came in green. The creek ran. The calves were born. The students came back to school. Life resumed its forward motion. Hugh assessed the herd and rebuilt the losses over the next 2 years with the methodical patience that was his most consistent quality, and the ranch recovered and then surpassed where it had been before the hard winter, partly because Hugh Monroe was a careful and intelligent man, and partly because some of the surrounding land became available when other ranchers could not come back from their losses, and he bought it at fair prices from men who needed to sell. The boys grew. Clara grew. The school grew. The reading circle had 17 regular members in 1889. The library Violet had been building occupied an entire room of the house and had begun to overflow into the hall and the sitting room, and she was drafting a letter to the territorial government about the possibility of a proper public library for Garnet Creek, which the railroad had transformed from a bowl-shaped valley outpost to a legitimate small town with aspirations. In 1890, Wyoming was admitted to the United States as the 44th state. It was the first state to join the Union with women's suffrage already included in its constitution, something that had been part of the territory's law since 1869, and that the state refused to give up even when the United States Congress suggested it might be tidier to come in on the same terms as everyone else. Wyoming had replied in essence that it would come in as itself or not at all, which was the kind of response that Violet Monroe found deeply satisfying and which she read aloud to Hugh at the kitchen table while Robert attempted to climb the wood box in the background. "That's the right answer," Hugh said. "It is," Violet said. "You should run for something," he said. She looked up. "What do you mean? School board, town council. There's an election in the fall." He said it with the same directness with which he said everything true. "You're the most qualified person in this valley for any position that requires thinking carefully about what this community should be." Violet considered this. She had not considered it before. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned over ideas that needed examining, looking at all the angles. "Would you support me?" she said. He looked at her with those eyes. "Through everything," he said. She ran for the Garnet Creek School Board in the fall of 1890 and won by the largest margin in the board's short electoral history, which Ellis Carr, who counted the votes, reported with visible pleasure. She served on the school board for the next 8 years and was responsible in that time for the addition of a second teacher, a complete library of over 400 volumes, and a curriculum that was among the most rigorous in Wyoming, which produced graduates who went on to the normal school in Laramie and in 2 cases to the university. Their 4th child arrived in 1891, another boy they named Thomas, who from infancy showed the particular quality of someone who is watching everything and storing it all up for later use, a quality that was so recognizable in his mother that Hugh laughed the first time he truly saw it in the baby's face. "He's yours," he said. "He's ours," she corrected. "He looks at things the way you look at things," Hugh said, "like he's reading them." "Terrible habit," Violet said, looking at the baby with transparent delight. 4 children. The house was full in the specific way that a house is full when it is the center of things, when it is being actively lived in by people who are glad to be in it together. Samuel was 7, and already reading at a level that made his mother proud and somewhat competitive. Clara was 6, and had demonstrated a talent for arithmetic that surprised her father, who had assumed, and admitted later that he should not have assumed, that she would follow her mother toward books. Clara Monroe liked numbers with an intensity that was absolute, and that would eventually, years later, take her to Laramie, and from there to a position of considerable respect in the field of land surveying, which was perhaps the most thoroughly Wyoming-appropriate destiny imaginable. Robert was 4 and was everywhere simultaneously, and was the primary reason that the new fence around the kitchen garden had been built to the height of 4 feet rather than 3. Thomas was growing. Violet and Hugh were 32 and 37, respectively, and in the prime of a life that they had built with care and continued to build with care, neither of them taking any of it for granted. There were evenings when they sat on the porch together after the children were in bed, in the summer dark, with the mountains against the sky and the smell of the kitchen garden, and the sounds of the ranch settling into night. And they did not speak for long stretches because there was no need to, and because they had each learned, over years of living in genuine intimacy with this other person, that silence shared with the right person is one of the finest things available to a human being. On one such evening in the summer of 1892, Hugh took her hand and held it on the arm of the chair between them and said, without preamble or context, "Do you remember what you said on the ridge that day in February, the day the thaw came?" "I said I wanted to stay through everything," Violet said. "Yes. I meant it then," she said. "I know. I mean it more now," she said. "Considerably more. Each year there is more to mean it about." He turned his head and looked at her in the summer dark. "I think about that morning every day," he said. "The morning you came to my door, I think about how close I was to not opening it." "But you did," she said. "I did," he said. "Best thing I ever did." Violet turned her head to look back at him. In the light from the house behind them, his face was in shadow, and then in light in a slow alternation as the lamp inside moved in a breath of air through the window. He was 37, and the years showed in his face in ways that she found more beautiful than anything she had words for. The lines around his eyes from a decade of squinting into western sun, the gray that was beginning in his hair at the temples, the particular settled quality of a man who has found his life and is living in it fully. "Hugh," she said. "Yes. I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I was so afraid," she said. "When I came here, not of you. Of what I wanted. I had been afraid of wanting things for so long that I had nearly stopped altogether. And then I was in your kitchen that first morning and I looked at you and I thought, very quietly in the back of my mind where I barely let myself hear it, that if the world were arranged the way it should be, this is the kind of man I would have wanted to find." Hugh Monroe said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "And did you find him?" She smiled. "I found him," she said. "I found him and I stayed, and he let me stay through everything. And it turned out that everything was more than I had ever dared to imagine." He lifted her hand from the arm of the chair and brought it to his mouth and held it there, the way he had in the kitchen on the night she had told him she loved him, the way he had on the day Samuel was born, the way he had in 100 moments over the years that she had filed in the box under the bed alongside the things that mattered most. "Good," he said, against her hand. "Good." The stars came out over Wyoming, thick and cold and magnificent, the same stars that had been over this valley long before Hugh Monroe had come to it, and long before Violet Cooper had knocked on his door, the same stars that would be there long after them both. But for now, in the summer of 1892, they were the particular stars of two people who had found each other and meant to keep each other, and the night was warm, and the house behind them was full of children and books, and the life they had chosen and built and continued to build, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time. Inside, Samuel stirred in his bed and called for water, and they heard Clara's voice answering him in the older sister tone that she had perfected at age 4, and Robert made a sound that suggested he might be awake but was choosing not to announce it, and Thomas slept the deep, total sleep of the very young. Violet stood and Hugh stood, and they went inside together, back into the warm, particular light of their own house, and the door closed behind them, and the night went on being beautiful outside without requiring an audience. This was how it was. This was how it continued to be. A woman who had run from a hidden trap in one life and found, at the end of a long road, a man who met her at the door and let her in without conditions. A man who had locked his heart against another loss and opened it anyway to something that turned out not to be a risk at all, but the safest thing either of them had ever done. She had asked if she could stay through the cold, and he had said she could stay through everything, And in that answer, given with the quiet certainty of a man who did not say things he did not mean, the whole of their life together had been contained, already complete, already waiting to be lived. They lived it, fully, daily, gratefully, together.